This video is brought to you by absolutely no one. For this video I decided to accept no sponsorship because I didn't want to disrupt the flow of the video and your enjoyment of it. But it did take me about a month to produce it, so if you do want to support my work and you like these kind of deeply researched videos, check out my t-shirts on Spring. I've got some Christmas limited edition t-shirts and a collaboration t-shirt with Shad. Alternatively, you can support my work on Patreon. Thank you so much and Happy New Year. The Shroud of Turin is a centuries-old cloth bearing the image of a man some believe to be Jesus of Nazareth. Is it really the cloth that wrapped his crucified body, or is it just an elaborate medieval forgery? Is the shroud real? The purpose of this video is to provide you with the currently available most updated information about the shroud, while putting it in the right historical, literary, linguistic, medical and scientific frame of reference. Creating, if you will, an easy-to-access comprehensive data analysis of the corpus of shroud research, related evidence, observation data and correlated hypotheses. My main goal today is to give you unbiased empirical information, including truths many experts will purposely keep from you. My role is that of an unbiased messenger who will only convey researched and triple-checked information in order to equip you with the best possible data for you to make your own mind and decision. Your opinion, whichever it is respected. Feel free to share it in the comments. People of faith, agnostics and atheists are all welcome here. Our approach is going to be methodical, structured and academic. What is a shroud? A shroud is a piece of cloth in which a person is buried. Why is it called the Shroud of Turin? Turin, or Torino, is a city in the Piemonte region in northwest Italy. The shroud has been in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin since 1578. Hence, its name. What is it made of? Linen and in general cheap and readily available materials. Is the shroud mentioned in the Gospels? A burial linen cloth, which might be the shroud, is mentioned in the following verses. We'll discuss these in detail on section 12. As I understand, not everyone is interested in the Gospel accounts. However, keep in mind for now that Scripture does not mention any image on the shroud. The Shroud of Turin is an ancient burial cloth. It's made of linen which has been woven in the 3/1 herringbone pattern. We'll get back to the pattern in a second. As for its size, you'll find two different reported dimensions on the internet. That is because these were the dimensions prior to the 2002 preservation. But in 2002 the shroud was stretched out for preservation specifically for flat storage. So the reported post-preservation dimensions are 14 feet by 6 inches by 3 feet by 9 inches. From a historical and archaeological perspective, the measurements, although they would have been reported in cubits, are consistent with the sort of burial cloths used in Palestine in antiquity. However, it must be said that considering the cloth has been handled, stretched and manipulated for centuries, these don't necessarily represent the original dimensions. The linen shroud is 0.014 inches thick, and it's made of threads that have a diameter of 0.010 inches. Now keep in mind that each thread is made of approximately 70 to 120 linen fibers, and each linen fiber has a thickness of 0.0004 to 0.0008 inches. Upon close inspection, the linen is not comparable in quality to medieval European textile, which is substantially superior. The cloth appears to have a bold brown color and an underimage of a man in a faint sepia hue. More on image color on section 5.2. These brown lines on the sides are scorch marks from a fire that happened in 1532 that did not destroy the shroud but did leave marks on it and also opened holes. Where the image appears darker is due to a greater concentration of the affected fibers. The cloth is woven in a 3/1 herringbone twill. The weave and particular stitching are actually quite rare. With that being said, the shroud is a very poor product in comparison to medieval European fabrics. It's full of warp and weft weaving defects. As you begin exploring this subject, you'll notice that the shroud will be described as both cheap and common and expensive and rare. So which one is it? Here it's how it is. The linen itself, the material, is cheap and common, but the way it was produced, treated and woven make it very expensive, special, durable and rare. The sort of cloth that a rich man could purchase. We'll explain how to interpret that data on section 12. Also worth of note the fact that in backlit photographs the linen shows darker and lighter banding in both the vertical and horizontal planes or directions corresponding to the warp and weft threads. As I mentioned in the measurement section, the number of linen fibers per thread is not uniform. They go from 70 to 120, right? That is because the object is handmade. As most of you know, linen has poor elasticity, explaining why it wrinkles so easily. Thus, we could say the linen cloth has a sort of memory that can reveal how the cloth has historically been folded. Now, these fold lines in linen can be ancient, leaving a trace in the cloth mapping. Some of the fold lines on the shroud are very sharp and straight and present discoloration. We'll discuss the most accredited hypotheses on what that might be in the historical section. As we said before, banding is present on the shroud, but it's difficult to see in normal light. Well, banding happens when individual collections of flags have a slightly different hue as a result of being retted and bleached separately. For those who don't know, retting is the process of soaking the flax in water to separate the linen fibers from the main stalk or the flax plant. In this case, there is also evidence of a weed-based soap being used during the preparation of the flax, the evidence being a thin layer of sugar compound carbohydrates left as a residue of the washing process. What's due of note for now is that the preparation method is conform to Pliny the Elder's account on how ancient linen was produced. Medieval linen, however, was manufactured differently, and this is why mentioning the banding was important. All surviving high-quality medieval linens in the archaeological example show no banding, and none were made in the herringbone weave pattern. Archaeologists have discovered ancient wool artifacts made in the herringbone weave pattern, similar to the shroud, but these artifacts were found in the ruins of a Roman fort in Egypt, dated to the 1st century. So, because of banding and the weave pattern, the cloth points to antiquity. As you can see, there are 4 matched repetitions of L-shaped holes on the shroud. These are burning holes, but they predate the 1532 fire. The 4 matched sets of holes show a progressive level of damage. Forensically, this seems to suggest that when the shroud was burnt, it was folded in 4. The most accredited hypothesis for this sort of burning damage is that the cloth was burnt accidentally with hot incense during an ecclesiastical rite. A 1516 painting shows the holes, which is why I say that they definitely happened before the big fire in 1532. And that is because the shroud here doesn't have the side marks that will be a result of such fire. Worth of note that the L-shaped holes are present in the Hungarian Prey manuscript dating 1192, and the art itself probably dates back to 1160 or 1170. Also note the zigzag lines on the actual weave, which represent specifically the herringbone pattern. There are large areas of burnt damage, scorched lines and water stains. All of these are associated with the fire of 1532 at Chambéry, France, where the shroud was being kept. There are a total of 8 major burn blemishes on the shroud. The geometrical pattern of the burns occurred when molten metal from the silver lid of the casket in which it was contained melted, and molten silver came in contact with the shroud, creating a series of 8 burns. After the fire of 1532, Port-Clare nuns added patches on the burning holes. You can see them as these triangles on the shroud. They then proceeded to attach the shroud on a support backing that is called the Holland backing. Once compared to both the medieval Holland backing and the patches, the shroud appears to be much cruder. There are numerous water stains on the shroud as a result of water being used to douse the fire in 1532. But not all water stains that are on the shroud come from that event. In fact, some of the water stains that we see on the shroud are potentially ancient. For example, the water stain on the abdominal area and on the back of the head. Unusual signals were detected through ultraviolet spectroscopy scanning when reaching the area of the soles of the feet. This area contained elevated levels of dirt, and the same dirt was also found in correspondence to the areas of the nose and the left knee. The sort of particles that were examined, and mind you, these are so small they needed a 25 times sort of magnification, but they were all calcium carbonate or limestone. Now, what's interesting about crystals of limestone is that they can offer a sort of signature, meaning that they can point to a geographical source. The chemical signature of the calcite in this case seems to point to Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. This is because this limestone sample, together with subsequent analysis, are of the travertine aragonite variety. Although it is important to underline that these soil particles are indeed typical of Jerusalem, but also in general of any other arid Mediterranean area influenced by the winds of the Sahara Desert. Two more types of tests that were again performed seem to indicate a similar result, namely scanning electron microscopy and X-ray microfluorescence. They point to a soil nature corresponding to desertic or semi-desertic climates, together with a certain amount of calcite. All of these are typical ingredients of road dirt. Also, the dirt found on the feet could be consistent with the idea of a barefoot man, while the dirt on the left knee and the nose could point to the idea of someone falling on his knees and on his face. This, of course, is not definitive evidence by any means, but it is still quite intriguing. Simplistically speaking, we could say that the image consists of two things: the discoloration of the fibers and the blood marks. Differently from the watermarks, the fire marks, the blood stains, the image does not go through the fabric. In other words, it's a phenomenon that seems to only reside in the first to second microfibers. To give you perspective, there are approximately 200 microfibers per each thread, so extremely superficial. The image resides on less than 1% of a single thread, leaving the inner fibers of the thread untouched. We could therefore describe this image as the brownish outline of a naked bearded man with long hair lying with his hands covering his groin. Technically speaking, this is considered to be a generally low distortion image of a naked human body. Now, as you look for shroud images on the internet, you'll come by two types. The one on the left is the image of the shroud in natural light. The one on the right is an image that originated in 1898. It's basically secondopia, so it's a photographic negative. And the reason why it became so popular and so famous is because only in the negative image can you access so many details of the image that is referred to as a body image. As you examine the image, it will appear that the right hand is resting on top of the left hand. In reality, when you look at the body image, it's the other way around, as you can see in the negative. That is the representation of the body, so it's the left hand that it's resting on top of the right. In other words, the shroud image is a perfect photographic negative, as opposed to the blood, which is a positive image. Therefore, also the blood stain on the chest would be on his right side. In other words, the image on the shroud is a mirror image, as if it were reflected on a mirror. Worth of note, there are no side images of the body. Similarly, there is no image of the top of the head. When transmitted light is applied to the shroud, the image disappears, because there are no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains, or any substances to account for. Hence, the scientific interest. How did the image form? We'll talk about that on section 10. Scientifically speaking, the image, it's not a scorch, as you might imagine. Instead, it's a form of discoloration caused by dehydration. So, to dig even deeper, what happened is that the carbon atoms on the linen went from a single covalent bond into a double covalent bond. Now, however this was achieved, whether it be authentic or false, it's still fascinating, because it's a change of the arrangement of the outer electrons in the carbon atom of the cellulose molecules. And as a result, now the linen reflects light differently. And regardless of the tens of thousands of hours of study, no one knows how this was achieved. And as I mentioned before, no substance nor atoms were added onto the cloth. In other words, the cloth reacted to something. We have the letter 3 on the forehead, which is a blood stain, 2 exit wounds at the bottom of the left foot from 2 nails. The right cheek appears to be more swollen than the left cheek. The nose might be broken. Also, the image appears to be missing the navel. As you look at mostly at the back, but also in the front, you'll notice that from the back of the neck all the way down to the ankles, the body is filled with hundreds of scourges, and the exact numbers, where scholars kind of disagree on that, so I'm not going to give one specific number, but in the hundreds. Now, these scourge marks are consistent with the Roman scourging implement, which is called the flagrum, generally speaking wooden handle with 3 leather thongs, and then at the end you would have some tips which could be made of metal or bone. It's consistent to this specific implement. The crossing pattern also suggests that 2 people scourged the body, and because of the different angles, it's possible that these 2 people were of different height, one being taller than the other. The image is a monochrome half-tone image, meaning that there is no variation in color. Whatever it is that caused this color in the image, it lies in the 0.2 micron thick layer interpreted as the primary cell wall of the fibers, which means that whatever caused the image, it did not affect the cellulose of the medulla, so the inner fibers. So how do you explain the color? It's a chemical reaction involving oxidation, dehydration and conjugation of the polysaccharides composing the linen fibers. So in light of this evidence suggesting that the image is basically a result of a chemical reaction, then how should we read the hypothesis of it being painted on the shroud? How do the two things intertwine? There is no evidence of a coating or any extraneous material added to the fibers. The image carries no pigment in connection to a painting medium. With that being said, it is also important to underline the fact that paint debris is found on the shroud. The debris in question being iron oxide, which is a common compound in medieval paint. Regardless of that, the reason why we're not rushing to then say, well, that definitely indicates that it's a paint job, is because the iron oxide layer of which we are talking about is uniform throughout the entirety of the shroud, where the image is and when the image isn't. So it's evenly distributed, which means that this iron oxide, whatever it is not the reason why the image is on the shroud. Now, when I say that it's evenly distributed, there is an exception to that, but it's the blood stains which do contain a higher concentration of iron oxide, but that's for obvious reasons. Blood contains iron. So there are two possible hypotheses to explain this. One is, well, medieval copies, in the sense that people did create copies in the medieval period of the shroud. Again, we don't know if it's this shroud, but it is reported that they did. And when they did, in order to authenticate these copies, they would try and paint it, then they would put these paintings on top of the shroud just to make sure that it would match. Of course, they didn't do it when the paint was fresh, they did it when the paint was dry, but at a chemical level, that would still leave a trace. But the best possible explanation, in my opinion, is that which has to do with the production method, in other words, the retting, as we mentioned on section 4.4. To produce this specific type of linen, the flax would have been soaked in water. That could explain the uniform presence of iron oxide. Of course, to consolidate this point, several tests were done. No paint pigments, no paint carrying mediums on the image bearing linen fibers. Also, artworks, whether they be modern or medieval, they tend to not be uniform in intensity. There are always areas which have higher density of color than others, but the shroud has no variation of intensity. No particles between the threads, no capillary actions except for the blood, no signs of cementation between cloth fibers and thread, no capillary flow associated with any viscous paint. And you can contrast that with the areas which have blood, which do show capillary flow and cementation. Also, no brush stroke, no directionality, such as that which would result of mediums such as brushes. Again, this doesn't mean that the shroud is authentic or that the shroud really was Jesus' burial cloth, but it does mean that definitely the idea of it's just a medieval painting is wrong. Could still be a medieval forgery, but they didn't achieve it through painting. When it comes to the blood location and the head, we find the blood on the hair, both sides of the face, and in the beard. Now, this would be consistent with the idea of a crown of thorns, but again, it's just circumstantial evidence, because it could also be evidence of whoever did this tried to recreate the idea of the crown of thorns. But an interesting piece of information that can help us get closer to unlocking this mystery is the fact that, as we said, the image is a discoloration of the fibers, but there is no such discoloration where the blood is present. What we understand because of this is blood first, then the image. So the blood was the first substance that came into contact with the shroud. We also see a blood flow at the right elbow, and there is a significant amount of blood at the feet. There is clear evidence of blood at the area of the wrists. We don't see any image or sign of blood at the palm of the hands. That is also an interesting piece of information, because what we now know, and I will refer you to my dedicated video to how the Romans actually performed the crucifixion, the sort of iron nails that would be used to nail a person to the cross would be driven through the wrist, not through the palm, or definitely not through the palm alone. That is because if you only use the center of the palm of the hand to nail someone on the cross, well, the weight of the whole body would rip through that, which is why the Romans preferred to use the wrist instead, in order to maintain some bone structural support. The direction of the blood seems to be following gravity. We'll get back to that in a minute. If we decide to assume that the image does indeed represent a body that went through this level of scourging, then medically speaking, a highly likely result of such scourging would be hypovolemic shock, which is a life-threatening condition caused by rapid loss of blood or body fluids. Now, some people do mention rigor mortis, so the sort of stiffening of the body that happens after death, saying that he died on the cross, so shouldn't he be in this position? But the thing is that the idea that rigor mortis just keeps going is a popular myth. It's true that it happens, but it only lasts for a few hours, so there wouldn't really be a need for people to tie his hands in place, because after a few hours rigor mortis passes anyways. So, because of all this compelling forensic data and serological test results, there is no doubt that the blood is that of a human male. But what else can we learn from this blood? The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin. The blood stains test positive for 13 different blood components, including these, and suggest that it's an exudate from actual wounds, not just blood that was put there. As we mentioned before, there is evidence of gravity because the thickest part of the blood is at the bottom of the scourge, but not all the blood on the image is the same. Let's have a look at the blood on the right side. So in theory, if again the shroud is real, the area where Jesus was stabbed by a Roman soldier with a spear. There is an identifiable separation between blood and blood serum. This only occurs when you stab a dead body. And that is because after a person dies, the blood stops circulating and therefore the hemoglobin, which is red, is separated by the clear plasma. And again, if we are to believe the gospel account, then he was speared by the Roman soldier after he was dead, to check if he was dead. And it is mentioned that from that wound, both blood and water came out. Now, of course, people in the medieval period understood medicine. We shouldn't imagine them as being ignorant, so they would have known this. But it still shows that if this is fake, they did an incredible job, because they literally thought of everything. So, what blood type is this? The data tells us that the blood type is AB, but we need to be careful how we read this. It could be that it actually is AB type, but it could also be a false AB. What does that mean? Without going too technical, in blood there is something called antigen. You've got antigen A and antigen B, but with time, and in this case a lot of time, these antigens deteriorate, and therefore blood, or a blood sample that is very ancient, could, because of deterioration, give a false positive for an AB. So it's either a real AB or it was another type that we can't identify anymore that was modified because of time. We are now about to enter the historical section, a deep dive into almost 2,000 years of recorded history, some of which might have to do with the shroud. But before we do that, since I know that not everyone will watch until the end, I should mention the ginormous elephant in the room: carbon dating. Right after the historical section, I have an entire section dedicated to the carbon dating. Is the carbon dating correct? Is the carbon dating incorrect? I have a lot of interesting things to say about that too, so make sure to watch until the end. The first question I'd like to answer when it comes to the historical section is the following: were victims of crucifixion granted a Jewish burial? That is an interesting question to answer because for a very long time the answer to that would have been no, which already kind of makes it strange that then Jesus' body was placed in a tomb. But new archaeological evidence seems to suggest that in fact it was the case for at least some crucifixion victims to be allowed a Jewish burial. There is a plethora of places of historical interest that could be connected to the shroud if the shroud is authentic. In other words, if the shroud is real, it began in Jerusalem in the 1st century. If the shroud is false, then it began in the 14th century in medieval Europe. We're going to start right now and move back in time until we reach a point where we can no longer substantiate with historical evidence what we are saying. As we reach the end of what is currently known, we'll then try to reconstruct through literary, historical, archaeological and artistic evidence what we don't know. As of this moment, the shroud is the possession of the Catholic Church. That, however, was not always the case. In fact, it's a somewhat recent development of its history. The shroud was in fact the property of the House of Savoy for over 500 years. It was in private property, the House of Savoy being the Italian royal family. The rule of the House of Savoy in Italy ended in 1946 after World War II, but it's in 1983 that they will gift the shroud to the Holy See. As an interesting fun fact, some of the members of the Savoy family over the years actually got into the habit of cutting little snippets from the shroud and giving them as royal gifts. Could you believe that? Well, before coming to Italy, the shroud was in France and was the property of Margaret de Chamy, whom in 1453 sold it to the Savoy family in exchange for not one but 2 castles. As a little side note, the Catholic Church wasn't particularly happy about that and they excommunicated her. Before that, the shroud has a certifiable history that goes all the way back to 1349, which is when it appeared or surfaced in Lire, France, being the personal property of the French nobleman Geoffrey de Charny or Geoffrey de Charny, no idea. Did the family ever tell us how they got the shroud? No, they only said that it was freely given. Then what about before that? Well, if the shroud is a medieval forgery, then it would be made in the 14th century, as the carbon dating seemed to suggest, therefore that will be the end of it. But there are a lot of mentions that predate that specific date that have to do with the shroud that are absolutely fascinating. Now, is it the same shroud? We don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But I think they're very interesting. So let's check them out. Historical records do mention a shroud that really looks exactly like this one in 1204 in Constantinople. We'll discuss how it got there in a minute, but there is in fact a gap of 150 years between this mention in Constantinople and Lire, France, which are called the missing years, where no one knows where the shroud went. But there is a possible indication or a suggestion or a hint that could answer that question, and it has to do with the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was endorsed by the Catholic Church, where it was mostly perpetrated by the French and the Venetians, the latter providing most of the transportation and logistics. The original intent of the Fourth Crusade, if we are to believe the accounts, was to secure certain routes to the Holy Land. But things didn't go that way. In fact, one of the things that happened that created a lot of controversy was the siege of Constantinople. Constantinople was an incredibly rich and successful city, and the French and the Venetians decided to do a little detour and go siege it. Now, this was a big deal because at the time Constantinople was Christian, and Crusaders were specifically forbidden to siege a Christian city, but they didn't care. Period records tell us that after months of siege, the troops storm into the city and they start looting. And when I say looting, I don't mean just private property or royal property, I'm talking about they started looting churches too. Good Christians, these Crusaders. Really, I'm impressed. But medieval archives tell us a difference between how the French looted and how the Venetians looted. The Venetians mostly stole gold and silver. The French instead were more interested in holy relics. Now check this out. There is a report written by Robert de Clare, who was a French knight who participated in the Fourth Crusade and was at the siege of Constantinople. He said that in Constantinople there was a cloth that was raised up every Friday on a church in the city of Constantinople to represent Jesus' resurrection. He talked about this as a holy relic, and he also says that no one, neither Greek nor French, ever knew what happened to the cloth. What does it mean that the cloth was raised, and was this cloth in fact the Holy Shroud? If you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that some of the folding lines on the linen seem to suggest that the linen was folded over a wooden batten of some sort or a block, and that I was going to tell you something about an hypothesis on what this would be. Well, this is the hypothesis. The idea is that a device was created in Constantinople to not only store the cloth inside this box, but to also make it go up and raised vertically. A sort of very ceremonial and ingenious way to kind of represent Jesus' resurrection. This would make sense in Constantinople because Orthodox tended to be very ceremonial like that. A replica of a device like that was in fact recreated in our day and age, and it works. So is this device mentioned by this specific French knight the same that left the marks on the shroud that we have? And if that is the case, then would that indicate that the shroud is the same and was indeed in Constantinople during the siege in the early 13th century? If the answer is yes, then that would explain how, from these crusades, the cloth went from Constantinople all the way to France. This isn't full-on evidence, we can't prove it, but it's interesting, and there is more. For the shroud to be real, this history had to have begun in Jerusalem. If you're a Christian, that would mean that after Jesus' resurrection, he would have left the linen cloth in his tomb, and then he would have left. If you're not a Christian, then after Jesus' death, his body would have been removed, leaving the linen in the tomb. Okay, so what now? Let's have a look at what we know of the world at the time. In the 1st century AD, Rome was of course the most important city in the empire. The second one would have been Alexandria of Egypt, but the third largest and more important city within the Roman Empire would have been Antioch. Antioch was annexed by the Roman Republic in 64 BC and was made the capital of the Roman province of Syria. Before that, it was the center of the Seleucid Empire. It would have been a city of magnificent temples, theatres, baths and aqueducts. The city of Antioch also has some important connections within the history of Christianity, in the sense that it was one of the most important communities of Christians lived in Antioch, and it's probably where the term Christian was coined. Now, when it comes to the history of the Shroud, what we're trying to build here is a connection between the city of Jerusalem and the city of Antioch. In 70 AD, we have the sack of Jerusalem, a decisive event in the First Jewish-Roman War, during which a Roman legion led by future Emperor Titus besieged Jerusalem. That was mostly because at this time Jerusalem had become the center of Jewish rebel resistance in the Roman province of Judea. So what happened to the original linen used to wrap Jesus' body at this time? An answer might come from what is called the Sermon of Athanasius. Let's check it out. Athanasius tells us that early Christians fled the city of Jerusalem before the attack actually began and went to Antioch. This was written years after the fact, so we can't really consider it period evidence, but there is a mention that is interesting, because Athanasius tells us that the people that fled took with them the very important and sacred icon of Christ. Now, we don't know what this icon was, but it is possible that it was the original linen, particularly if it already had the image within, something that we can't really prove. But it's interesting. So if this connection were to be true, the original cloth would have moved from Jerusalem to Antioch. In 540, however, Antioch is sieged and destroyed by the Persians. Now, at this time, within the city of Antioch, there was a patriarch by the name of Euphramus, and he tells us that he struck a deal with the Persians, telling them, "You can have everything, but don't destroy the main church." And the Persians agree. Keep in mind that everything else, the rest of the city, was leveled to the ground. This is when Euphramus leaves the city and moves to the province of Cilicia. 14 years after this event, in 554, an image of Christ impressed on linen appears in the city of Camuliana, which is in Cilicia. The Patriarch of Antioch was definitely one of the most prominent and important members of Christianity, so it's not impossible to think that he would have brought, or would have even had and then brought, the icon, the original linen, to Camuliana, and then 14 years afterwards we see an image appear with that description. This is the first time that the idea of an image of Christ impressed on linen is mentioned historically. In 554, another image, so a different linen with the image of Christ impressed, appears in the city of Edessa. After having taken Antioch, the Persians will also try to siege and take Edessa, but they will fail. And it's interesting that the historical record tells us that the people of Edessa believed that it was the sacred icon, the image of Christ, that had protected the city. The situation becomes even more intriguing with the following two dates: 574 and 943. These are the dates when the Byzantine Empire seized both images. First, the image of Camuliana, and then the image of Edessa. Both now belonged to the Byzantine Empire, and they are brought to Constantinople. Was one of these two the shroud we are looking at and examining today? It's possible. And if that were the case, it would create a historical link of events that would lead from Jerusalem all the way to Constantinople. And remember that from the previous section in history, we learned that a sacred, very important icon was taken by the French in Constantinople during the siege during the Fourth Crusade. The elites of Constantinople even writing a letter of complaint to the Pope, where they specifically mentioned the French even took the most holy image of Christ. So what I'm trying to say here, I'm not trying to absolutely defend the image or the current shroud, but I'm trying to say that there is a logical, possible line of events that lead from Jerusalem all the way to Lille, France. Now, some people say that this is definitive evidence that the carbon dating is wrong. I disagree with that. It is not definitive evidence, but it is interesting because it also helps us understand that there is a possibility that the shroud we have today is the same as either the image of Camuliana or the image of Edessa. However, I also believe it's critical to be intellectually honest and underline and say that forgeries, particularly in the medieval period, but also throughout the classical period, were in fact made. Many times, a relic of that stature would have a massive geopolitical power behind it. So there is absolutely motive to create a false like that. Radiocarbon dating is essentially a method designed to measure the residual amount of the radioactive carbon isotope, C14, found in a tested sample. The fuss about the carbon dating results is the fact that they point, when it comes to the origins of the current shroud that we have, between a date between 1260 and 1390. But there is some controversy and a very heated debate on the validity and correctness of these test results, with people trying to absolutely push the shroud as being true, completely refuting the results, and people who instead consider these results to be the last nail in the coffin, which unmasks the shroud as a fraud. I would like to propose a more balanced approach to this. The most logical question that we would have to propose right now is the following. How accurate is carbon dating? Of course, considering how deep and complicated carbon dating is as a topic, and considering how long this video is already, I probably can't fit everything into this section. I'll have to make a dedicated video. But for now, I'd like to leave you with two facts. Number one, carbon dating is a useful tool, it's a scientific tool, and it's usually pretty reliable. But it's not infallible. So it shouldn't be considered as a definitive absolute proof, but it should instead be corroborated by archaeological, literary and other forms of evidence, and possibly done on different sections of the one object that has been examined. Two, we also need to look at how a certain carbon dating analysis was carried out. Who performed the test? The radiocarbon dating on 1988 on the shroud was done under the project management of the British Museum. The three laboratories that were involved were the laboratory of Oxford, Zurich and Arizona. They measured the relative amount of C14 on the shroud, and there is no reason to doubt their professionality in making such measurements. How was the test performed? The original plan was for the scientists to use 7 different samples from all over the shroud. What actually happened is that they only used one sample, a little snippet that was taken from the bottom right corner of the shroud as you look at it from the front. Could the whole shroud, or maybe just the snippet they have taken, have been compromised? Well, that is what the proponent of the idea of the carbon dating being wrong are trying to push. So let's see where they're coming from. If the carbon dating is indeed wrong, then it would have to be in error by a large factor. So what would be the possible reasons to explain such a largely mistaken result? Well, whenever we work with carbon dating, we have to keep in mind that the validity of the dating is based on the following assumptions. The sample or samples tested are representative of the whole. Some people say that the corner might have been the area of a medieval repair. Second, the possibility of carbon contamination. For the tests to be correct, no contamination has had to have affected the C14 content of the sample area except for the natural radioactive decay of C14. And as explained, in order to give accurate aging data, the carbon degree must not have had significant contamination. Reweave hypothesis. This hypothesis wants to suggest that the corner of the shroud that they used for carbon dating was used for repairing the shroud. However, the experts involved in the 2002 Shroud Conservation Project examined the sample area and reported that they could not identify any evidence of reweaving. The next idea was the bioplastic contamination, the hypothesis being that living microbes such as bacteria or fungus would have contaminated the shroud, leaving a sort of bioplastic coating on the fibers, which would explain the anomalous dating result. However, this hypothesis was completely debunked, since for it to literally change the radiocarbon tests, the amount of biomass would have essentially required a near doubling of the mass on the sample by the bioplastic contamination, and this was not recorded. During my research on this subject, I've noticed that people tend to have a very strong position. You either have people that absolutely try to push the shroud as authentic and they keep saying carbon dating is wrong, we know carbon dating is wrong, we don't know why. And then you have people saying, you see, carbon dating just disproved everything. Personally, even though I am in support of the importance of carbon dating and the importance of actual raw data to work with, it is also important to take into consideration all the historical facts and all the different artistic, literary, archaeological aspects of this, the way it was produced and everything we've talked so far, which do seem to point to antiquity. And I believe that the test, the way it was done, is not enough to completely dismount all of that. This is why personally, as my stand, I will be a massive proponent of a retesting of the sample, in fact, a retesting of several samples on the shroud. Also because remember, this test was from 1988 and I'm sure that the technology and science has evolved significantly. Now, there are several image formation hypotheses. I would like to group them all together and sort of give you an idea of what people think. These hypotheses can be divided into three categories: dead body hypotheses, artistic hypotheses, and radiation hypotheses. When it comes to anything that deals with the contact of the body to the shroud, so the idea is the contact of the corpse with the linen fibers produce the image, nothing so far, no tests, no data has been able to justify the image formation through contact. Bodies don't leave images like that. And remember also that there was no sign of putrefaction. Painting and dusting hypotheses also don't seem to have a solid ground to stand, mostly because, as we were saying before, there is no sign of pigmentation or any paint that could justify this sort of artistic creation. And as you keep digging into your research on the shroud, this is where you start leaving the realm of our current understandings of the laws of physics. So bear in mind that some of the hypotheses I'm going to mention now are almost, to be honest, border with sci-fi. The radiation fall-through hypothesis, the Antonacci version of the fall-through hypothesis, the electric field corona discharge hypothesis, and the electric field electric charge separation hypothesis. The idea of bringing up some sort of radiation or magnetic field. Another hypothesis that was brought up was that of liquid acid, but then again, as we examine the fibers, we see a lack of capillarity or soaking up of a liquid, which ends up ruling this one out. The usage of chemicals to explain the image formation was also rejected, mostly because it couldn't explain the superficiality of the shroud image, which, as you will recall, is limited to the uppermost surface of the fibrils. Chemicals that touched the shroud would have in many places penetrated beyond that surface. So what do they mean when they say radiation hypotheses? What sort of radiation could have happened? How is this even within the realm of the scientific discourse? I'm going to share the idea with you. Whether you think it's completely nonsense or whether you think there could be something to it, it's up to you. The proposed idea is that of a burst of radiation, which would have affected the neutrons involved in the image encoding event. Keep in mind that both electrostatic and gravitational fields are excluded because of the tests. Well, if you look at the image, one of the things that I haven't mentioned so far is the skeletal features. If you look at the hand and some parts of the face, it's as if you're seeing both the flesh and the skeleton from the inside at the same time. What you're seeing are the metacarpal bones extending all the way to the left wrist. We don't know why this is the case, but it's as if the image has recorded both the inside and the outside of the hand. Researchers have proposed the idea that a burst of radiation produced from within the body carried and communicated radiation. But I do have to again stress that this would be absolutely outside of our understanding of the laws of physics. Also because you see, photons are emitted in every direction, but this image formation event, whatever it was, does nothing to show that, because there is no side image, and there is no image of the top of the head, which means that this burst of radiation would have to have been completely vertical to even make sense. Now, of course, some of the Christian researchers have pushed forward this idea that that could be Jesus' resurrection, in the sense that, and to back this idea up, they use the Gospel's account of Jesus emanating light. But I won't dig into this because this isn't a religious video. So if you're interested to just check out Giulio Fanti's research, if that's something you're into, feel free to do that. If you're interested in this whole discussion about blood, then, and as you Google it, you will find that there is a sort of controversy when it comes to the blood flow itself. Some people say, well, this is clearly fake because the blood shouldn't be flowing on the actual linen, because by then the body would have been laying flat. So why is it flowing down? It's an interesting point, but to me it doesn't hold much water. Simply because whoever this body was, we have no idea how it was handled before, during, and after it was placed in the linen. There is no way to answer that question. And another question that we could bring up is, well, if this is really Jesus and we are to follow the gospel account, then he was on the cross for about 6 hours. Wouldn't the blood have been dried by then? Or at least some of it, if not the one on the sides. But simply because blood is dry, it doesn't mean it won't stain. Was the linen pressed on him? Was he moved in the linen? Or did they put the linen afterwards? We don't know. And at this moment, there is no way to know. So definitely this whole controversy that is supposed to prove that it's fake, I'm not trying to defend this at any costs, but that's not enough. So the whole blood flow controversy isn't solid. Last but not least, I would like to mention and discuss the Gospel accounts. Of course, this is going to be a complete secular approach. I'm looking at the Gospels as books written at a specific time period, namely the 1st century, as accounts. If you remember at the very beginning of the video, I mentioned that this would have been the cloth of a rich man, but that seems to contrast with the idea of Jesus being a very poor man. An answer to this could come from the Gospel, because the Gospels tell us that it's Joseph of Arimathea, who was the owner of the tomb, a very rich man, that actually bought the linen to wrap Jesus. So, if we are to take this account and consider it to be true, that would explain why the linen is so expensive. It would fit what we are told in Mark. John tells us that Jesus was bound in strips. Now that's interesting because it contrasts with what Matt and Luke tell us, which is that he was wrapped in a linen or in a clean linen cloth. So when John talks about strips, could that mean basically what you do to an Egyptian mummy? Well, historically speaking, I seriously doubt that. The reason being that by the 1st century, not even the Egyptians were doing that anymore, so never mind the Jews. All we know about the Jewish burial traditions is that they used white linen cloths to wrap the dead bodies. Hands, feet and chin sometimes were wrapped in strips, and then a full-on linen cloth would be wrapped around the body. Also remember that a separate cloth for the face would also be used. When it comes to Jesus' account, the cloth that would cover his face was actually put on him while he was still on the cross. Some believe that to be the sudario or Orvieto, which is found in Spain, and some research has been done to point to the fact that the fibers might be the same as that of the shroud, or there is some connection between the two. But as I have mentioned at the beginning of this video, none of the gospel accounts mention an image. So this can be read in two possible ways. Either there is no image in the original linen cloth that was used to wrap Jesus, and then that one just got lost, and this is a different artificial icon that was created later on, maybe in antiquity or maybe in the Middle Ages, or the image formed afterwards. But the one thing we know is that we cannot explain at this point why and how the image was formed, which to me makes this subject still very intriguing. Alright, noble ones, we've come to the end of this very long journey. I hope that you have enjoyed it, and if you are still here, well, thank you so much for watching until the end. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet members of this community, become a noble one, subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Please let me know, what do you believe? What is your gut feeling, or what is the result of your research? Do you think that the shroud that is now in the church in Turin is the original real shroud that wrapped Jesus' body, or do you think that it is in fact a medieval fake? Well, let me know in the comments below. And again, if you enjoyed this detailed video, make sure to check my Teespring account and see if you can find a t-shirt you like. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.